we had this conversation, and it's a very passionate conversation because in addition to being grouped differently within the Latinx spectrum, we also talk about geography. Whereas in California, the relationship between Latinos, Latinx people, and Black people in California are very different than the relationships or the relations between Latinos, Latinx people, and Black American people in New York. And then Florida is a whole other thing. I do think it's important for everybody to see what their issues are within their community. How do we find common ground?
That's a great question. Again, I think the first key, first and foremost, has to be education, right? Like, so it's very difficult, or it's a much greater challenge for us to come together if you are hell bent on denying who you are just so you can be away from me, right? Like if so much of where you are psychologically is hell bent on denying your Black blood and denying your Blackness and denying your place in the diaspora, then you're already trying to separate yourself in a way that is kind of difficult. Likewise, if I don't understand or appreciate that the only thing that was different between my ancestors and your ancestors is that you got dropped off at an earlier point and your colonizer spoke a different language than mine, right? Then I'm also sort of harboring that difference. So a lot of that starts with education, right? The second piece that I would say is it has to be, as cliche as it sounds, it has to be broken down into humanity, because we did frame this conversation around voting because it's political season. We're in the middle of an election. We still don't know who the president is going to be technically. So I understand that. But on a larger level, like if you step out, Black people don't necessarily feel like members of other ethnic demographics have shown up for us around humanitarian issues in the same ways that we've shown up for them. So if you look at DACA, that's a policy, political issue. But if you look at immigration, and not just Trump, but also Obama and cages and everything else around families being separated and those things, in large part, in my community, I did see a number of people who were extremely vocal around those issues. That's not to say that it may have been as big or as it should have been, but I'm saying that I saw it.
Right.
But when you look at necessarily like in large, right, when you look at the conversation about police violence against communities of color and police violence against Black people, there are a lot of Black people who do not feel like members of the Latin community have shown up for us in the ways that we would like. That's not to say that it's been completely absent,
right?
But it is to say, like, on a certain level, people be feeling like, yo, so this shit don't affect y'all, or it doesn't affect y'all because you don't think you're like me, so that you don't have to show up, and that's very, very offensive, and it's very insulting, and it's very kind of like, I'll remind you, you and I had a conversation about hip hop very briefly. It's like Snoop at the '96 Source Awards, where he's like on stage, like, "Oh, word, that's how you feel? Oh, okay, cool. Let it be known then." And that's how a lot of us feel. And so when you detach that from the issue of around humanity, it makes it a lot harder for us to come together. So I think the very first thing is education, and then I think after that, like, it has to be the ability to just simply examine the issues that matter to us from the perspective of being human. And then finally, like, when you get to the more finite, more specific points, it is a question of like, all right, now, how does aligning with you on this particular issue affect my ask for my community? That's the scalpel, right? Like, and there may come a point where it's like, I can only go so far with you on this because of the way that the things that I need to get done in my community. And in some places, it's like, I can go with you all the way on this, but that's the last step. And a lot of times I feel like we sort of start there instead of starting on the front end. And that's where I think we get it wrong.
So now, I got to respond to what you're saying, because I do agree with a lot of that. I mean, but I think that is very important for people to understand that people who've been colonized in other parts of the world, no different than the people who've been colonized in America, also practice self-hate. So when we have these conversations about how, first of all, when we talk about DACA as it being an exclusively Latino issue, as if that Africans that come here or people that come from Jamaica or people that come a lot of Black people are also recipients of DACA. And excluding Black people from these conversations leaves a big group of people with no place to call home when the Latinos or Latinx people are employing their racism against them. And then Black people in America are saying, you ain't one of us either. So when we talk about immigration as it is a total exclusive Latinx issue without acknowledging the fact that Latinx people are also Black, also Indigenous.
Sure.
It's also very problematic where I feel sometimes that Latinx people are held to a higher standard than everybody else in the world, where anti-Blackness is practiced in Asia. Indian people practice it. Even Black American people practice anti-Blackness, but I think the talking points don't come from us. They come from the mainstream media who love to continuously perpetuate these fights because it is far more profitable for us to hate each other when Latinos, Latinx people are the second group who is killed by the police unjustly in this country. And we never talk about that. It took Black Lives Matter to talk about Andres Guardado. Again, Black people showing up for Latinos and Latinx people. It took Black people to say, hey, they killed this Mexican boy in LA. They killed this Mexican boy in Sacramento. But what I'm saying is, how do we really start to heal from this when we engage in respectability politics when it comes to Latin people? But and I think that a lot of times we blame them for their own oppression because the self-hate that they're practicing is all part of the colonization. And so it's no different in any part of the world than it is here in America.
So I think we really do have to focus on the education piece, because without that, without the enlightenment piece in terms of breaking cultural stereotypes that have allowed anti-Blackness to permeate within our communities that have been passed down, we're susceptible to that manipulation, right? So I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. I have a couple of friends, like as you said, I'm a lawyer, right? And so I have a couple of friends who are members of the Dominican Bar Association in New York. And this summer there was a conversation among the board members of that bar association about just issuing a statement. Just issuing a statement, not marching, not doing any protests, simply issuing a statement in support of not necessarily BLM, but ending systemic racism, acknowledging violence against Black people in America, and so on and so forth. There was literally almost virtually, because everything was through Zoom, but a knockdown, drag out fight with members on that board who were against it because they were like, I'm Dominican, I don't identify as Black.
Right.
What does that have to do with you? Whether you do or don't is one conversation, right? But what does that have to do with recognizing the humanity of another oppressed group?
That's right.
That conversation is what needs to happen. What I can tell you is, as an American-born Black person, I am constantly inundated with conversations about the need to be more inclusive. I got to be more inclusive of every other community. I have to understand every other community and their culture within America, despite the fact that within that conversation, I'm the only one who's actually born here in America. Not that that matters, but within the context of our conversation, hear me out. Right. What conversation is occurring across the aisle in Latinx communities, for example, to be like, yo, we got to be inclusive. We got to be inclusive too. I feel like on a certain level, all of that pressure, and I think that's where the resentment comes in. That's where the tension rises, because we are exclusively pressured to be inclusive of other groups that are not pressured internally or externally about the need to be inclusive of us. So it's like we're the ones holding our hands out, and maybe somebody shakes our hand, maybe they leave us holding a bag. Our experience has left us jaded. And I think that was sort of reinforced with some of the numbers that we saw from the exit poll. So I think, to answer your question, that pressure around inclusion has to be spread out. It has to be shared in other groups in the same way that it's shared to us. Because if there's an expectation that as people of color, as Black people, as American descendants of slavery, that we are supposed to be more inclusive of other groups because of the fact that we are all channels of the diaspora, then we need to be able to look at the other channels of the diaspora and understand that those same conversations about being inclusive, building coalitions, and then supporting those coalitions is being taken seriously.
And listen, I'm one of those people, right? Because I am the one that gets the self-hating messages about how I don't love my own people.
Right.
Because I believe in that, and I agree with what you're saying, right? Because when those babies were locked up in those cages, and it became mainstream news because babies have been locked up in cages forever. And I actually said, this has to matter to my community as much as Tamir Rice's death matters to my matter the same, because if not, we can't ask people to come and say, hey, what I battle with sometimes is that a lot of times the Black people are Latinos, right? And yes, they're, like I grew up in Miami, Florida, between Miami and New York, but I lived in the Dominican Republic when I was little. But I grew up in a city that is made up of communities who do not want to interact or assimilate. There's Little Haiti, Little Havana, blah, blah, blah. And everybody is being told that Black people in America are lazy and they're violent through the media, all the effects of colonization. And then they tell Black people in America that immigrants are coming here and they're trying to take your scraps from you. Because in reality, ain't nobody who's coming here to be to work with a leaf blower and be a landscaper really taking what is rightfully yours, because what's rightfully yours is abundance, right? You built this country. There's hundreds and hundreds of years of free labor. And what Black people deserve in this country beyond humanity is economic power, because the truth of it is that we don't talk about those things from the most honest place.